on the air with President Biden, just a couple hours away from making his close to primetime push for gun reform after another mass shooting takes the lives of 4 more people, this time at a hospital in Oklahoma. What we're learning now about why the shooter did it, plus new details out of Uvalde, Texas, and how the incident commander there apparently didn't have access to those 911 calls we know were coming from kids inside the classroom. Also in the show tonight, a longer prison sentence for Michael Avenatti, frauding his own client, Stormy Daniels. Plus, as the U.S. lays out new sanctions on Russian elites, an NBC News investigation shows a big U.S. consulting firm whose work in Russia raises a ton of conflict of interest questions in tonight's original. And in our backstory, our reporting on a black school superintendent in Mississippi who believes she was put on leave less than 1 year after she was hired because of her race. And a black actress in Disney's new Star Wars spinoff is sharing the hateful messages she's getting ahead of tomorrow's premiere. It's not the first time this has happened to a star in the franchise. We're going to explain that later in the show. Hey, I'm Hallie, and right now, listen, this is where we are in this country, a place where the families of the most recent mass shooting don't even have time to fully grieve the lives they've lost before a new group of families sees their loved ones become the victims of gun violence. As now, in the next couple hours, President Biden is getting ready to address the nation to try to address this crisis. Today, you've got another community dealing with this uniquely American epidemic, Tulsa, Oklahoma, after a shooter specifically targeted a doctor, blaming him for the pain he felt after back surgery.
We have also found a letter on the suspect which made it clear that he came in with the intent to kill Dr. Phillips and anyone who got in his way.
As the chief there mentioned, the man he targeted was Dr. Preston Phillips, an orthopedic surgeon at St. Francis in Tulsa. The other 3 victims, Dr. Stephanie Huson, another physician, Amanda Glenn, a receptionist, and William Love, a patient, who were all killed, police say, because they stood in the gunman's way. They're giving us a detailed timeline, not just into how quickly they got there, but into the fact that the shooter purchased one of the guns he used just hours before he killed these 4 people. Tulsa now becomes the 20th mass shooting since the Uvalde massacre just 8 days ago. That's any attack with 4 or more people shot. And speaking of Uvalde, 3 more families there are laying their beautiful little girls to rest today. You see them here. Eliahana Torres, a little athlete. She was a softball player. Miranda Mathis, who loved unicorns and mermaids, especially if they were purple. And Nevaeh Bravo, whose cousin says she is now flying with the angels above. And in just the last couple hours from Texas, we're getting new details about the 911 calls from inside the classroom. We'll have more on that a bit later. As here in Washington, besides the president's address, you've also got a key House committee talking about some gun reform bills, and the Senate may be close to a framework on another. So we have a lot to cover. We have a lot of angles on this, and we've got them all. Vaughn Hilliard is on the ground in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Priscilla Thompson is in Uvalde, Texas. Mike Memoli is posted up at the White House, and Ali Vitale is on Capitol Hill. Vaughn, let me start with you in Tulsa, and more on these new details we're getting about this broader timeline, because as we understand it, this shooter had been treated by Dr. Phillips for the past couple weeks.
Talk about this timeline, Hallie, that we're looking at. May 19th, he went in for surgery, back surgery here at this hospital. He wasn't released until May 24th, but he then returned on May 29th. Authorities say apparently because he had continuing back problems that led him to be frustrated and angry and take out his ire here on the hospital staff here. And that's also where the timeline collides with when he purchased these 2 firearms. May 29th, he purchased that 40-millimeter handgun. Then it was not until yesterday at 2 p.m., though, that he went to a local gun store and purchased an AR-15 at 2 p.m. At 4:52 is when authorities say that he entered the 2nd floor of this hospital targeting that orthopedic surgeon. Less than 3 hours later, from the time of that AR-15 purchase until the time in which he began firing. The other important part, though, that we need to address about this timeline, especially when we're comparing it, we're contrasting it to what we saw unfold in Uvalde, is the timeline in which that first 911 call came in at 4:52. Police, according to authorities, then arrived through the doors at about 4:55, 4:56. They said within 39 seconds of the time that they entered those doors, they heard then a gunshot, which is the gunshot that they believed to have been that self-inflicted gun wound after they yelled out, Tulsa police here. That is the gunshot wound that they believe took down ultimately the shooter. But in that time span, in just those few minutes that he was in that hospital, Hallie, he was able to kill 4 civilians.
And once again, it seems as though, at least at this early moment, this is a situation where it appears no laws were broken when the shooter got this gun, right?
Right, and that is the issue. Actually, listen to the police chief lay out here as part of this timeline when he was directly asked that.
The information that we have at the current time is that they were legally purchased firearms. One purchased an hour and some change before the actual shooting event took place, and the other purchased 3 days before the shooting took place.
There's such an intense debate, not only on Capitol Hill in D.C., but also at the state level about these laws that could potentially be put on the books here. And what you just heard was that apparently background checks were completed for not only the handgun, but also the AR-15. He apparently passed those and was able to acquire those weapons. The other issue is when we're talking about red flag laws. Authorities say that they were not aware of any heads up about him being a danger to the community at large, or even particularly this hospital. They did say that they received a call from the individual who they identified as his wife, but that call didn't come in until after the shooting. And the one other policy that we talk about, Hallie, is those waiting periods, that there are 9 states in Washington, D.C., in which there's a waiting period, often of several days, in which somebody wants to buy a handgun or an assault weapon, in which they have to wait in order to get approved, in order to purchase that. Here in Oklahoma, that law is not on the books here, which allowed him to go and purchase that gun and then just hours later open fire here in this hospital.
Vaughn Hilliard live for us on the ground there in Tulsa. Vaughn, thank you for your reporting. We mentioned what happened in Tulsa, the 20th mass shooting since Uvalde, Texas. And in Uvalde, in just the last few hours, we heard from a Democratic state senator, Roland Gutierrez, who says the on-site incident commander, Pete Arredondo, the Uvalde school police chief, did not have access, they believe, to those 911 calls we know were coming from kids inside the elementary school classroom where the shooter was. I want you to listen here. See if you pick up on not just the pain and the anguish, but the confusion in his voice as he's explaining this. Watch.
Uvalde PD was the one receiving the 911 calls for 45 minutes, while officers were sitting in a hallway 19 officers were sitting in a hallway for 45 minutes, and those calls weren't being, either they weren't, and here's another question we don't know. We don't know if it was being communicated to those people or not.
Priscilla Thompson is live for us in Uvalde now. The word that the state senator used, Priscilla, was befuddled to describe this new information. So let me sum this up. Now we're to understand that Arredondo did not have access to those 911 calls, they believe, that they were going to the Uvalde police, which is separate from the school police, and that those lines of communications just never connected.
Exactly, Hallie. That's what the senator is saying, that the dispatcher was sending those calls to the city police. But of course, as you mentioned, the person who was in command of that scene was the city school chief. And so the senator's office is saying it's unlikely that he knew that there were kids in that classroom calling 911, begging for help. And we heard the senator really getting emotional, issuing an apology to some of these families, and just calling it a complete failure. Take a listen to a bit more of what he said.
We have all failed. There's been a lot of failure here. You don't want to have to bury your 4th grader. That's not normal. They're supposed to bury you.
And so he went on to call it a complete and utter communication breakdown. And his office says the only way that Chief Arredondo would have known about those calls is if a city officer or someone from the city side of the police department had told him. And it's unclear that that happened. And so it's pretty remarkable to think that the person in charge of the scene did not know about the 911 calls that were coming in, when that is how part of how police assess these situations, right? Hallie?
There's this other sort of interesting piece of this, the New York Times is reporting, which is one of the teachers who was killed, one of these hero teachers, Eva Morales, was talking with her husband, who was an officer in the Uvalde School District Police Department before she died. He was not allowed to enter the school, but it does speak to what I think you're talking about and what we heard from the state senator, this broader confusion over what police were and were not allowed to do that day.
Right. So there is a judge here that has been briefed by the sheriff's office who sort of relayed this information to the New York Times, saying that Morales called her husband, who is a police officer in the school district. Her husband, of course, rushed there. He wanted to get into the school, and that other police officers prevented him from getting into the school. And so it's very possible that he was among all those parents that we've seen videos of outside of the school asking, why aren't police going in, yelling for them to do something. And so just an incredible failure of communication. And we're also now hearing from the mayor, who says he also rushed to the scene and was across the street in the funeral home with a negotiator who was trying to get the shooter on the phone. And so just what a juxtaposition of her husband getting these details, trying to get that information to people on the scene and get into that building. And you have the mayor across the street trying to get the shooter on the phone, likely presuming that this was a barricaded suspect situation, as we've been told has been communicated. Hallie?
Priscilla Thompson, live for us there in Uvalde, where, by the way, we're learning that the gunman's grandmother, who was shot in the face, is slowly recovering now. Priscilla, thank you. To Buffalo, where the white teenager arrested in the murders of 10 black people at a Buffalo grocery store in New York is pleading not guilty to the charges against him. That's what we saw go down in court today. You could actually hear family members of victims crying after the 18-year-old was escorted from the courtroom. A grand jury had returned a 25-count indictment against him, including 10 counts of first-degree murder, 10 counts of second-degree murder as a hate crime, 3 counts of attempted murder as a hate crime, and a count for domestic terrorism motivated by hate, along with a weapons charge. So with the backdrop, given all of this, right, the context of these horrific incidences of gun violence that we have seen in this country, President Biden, not long from now, is going to be giving a speech to the nation on gun violence. Not quite prime time, but close to it, with the White House describing this as a call to action to try to get Congress to compromise on some kind of gun reform legislation. The president supported expanding background checks and an assault weapons ban when he was a senator. And he's already announced some executive actions as president. But the White House says, really, in order for this to go as far as the president wants it to, Congress has to step up. Congress has to get involved here. This speech is coming just days after what you're seeing on screen here. The president and first lady visited Robb Elementary in Uvalde, laying flowers at the site there, consoling family members, and weeks after visiting a similar memorial near Tops grocery store in Buffalo. Joining me now is Mike Memoli. Mike, tell me what you're hearing from the White House about what the goal is for the president tonight. He has spoken about these horrific moments of gun violence in this country. He's talked about it a lot from the White House. He's talked about it in Uvalde, Texas, just recently. What is he hoping to deliver tonight that he hasn't been able to deliver so far as a message?
Well, Hallie, you know, we've seen over the course of his now almost year and a half in office, President Biden cast in a number of different roles. Sometimes he's been the explainer-in-chief, trying to lay out steps his administration has taken on COVID or the economy. He's sometimes, and to great political cost, been the legislator-in-chief, going through the weeds, especially on his economic program in Congress. We all remember the Build Back Better negotiations. But when I talk to White House officials, they say the president really is at his best when he is demonstrating that empathy, as we've seen him in Uvalde this week as the mourner-in-chief, but also really making and reconnecting to that message of his campaign to make a moral case about the soul of the nation. And as we look forward to his remarks tonight, I was pointed to what was, when I was covering him as candidate Biden, the very last event he did on the campaign trail before COVID really shut everything down was actually an event he did with some of the strongest gun rights groups, gun safety groups, I should say, in the country. It was an event in Ohio. And at the time, then candidate Biden said this. He said, this epidemic of gun violence in this country is intolerable, but it has become accepted as unfortunately normal. But he said for these families who've been grieving gun crimes, the normal is a national nightmare. And so he said, as president, he would not abide, the character of this nation could not abide to do nothing on guns. And that is, I'm told, the message he's going to be taking into his remarks tonight, to really make this, as you say, a call to action, to try to make the moral case for action at a time when so many gun advocates gun safety advocates, are frustrated with inaction and just really exhausted by it, frankly.
This feels aimed at a couple of different audiences, though, right? There's one audience who is going to be, frankly, all of us, regular Americans, tuning in, streaming it, watching it on TV, wherever, however you watch it, looking and listening to what the president has to say. But the other audience here, right, members of Congress. We're going to talk with Avenatti in a second here on what Congress is doing. But the White House has been very clear that at this point, the president can only do so much via executive action at the White House, that stronger changes must come from the building just down the way on Pennsylvania Avenue.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The White House has said repeatedly this week that President Biden has now done more by executive action than any president before him. And this is a president, by the way, who doesn't want to overdo it with executive action. He respects those checks and balances he said so often before. And so he really does want to try to spur the congressional action over the finish line. But there's real risk in this, Hallie. You know that, having covered this yourself, that sometimes you want a president to stay on the sidelines to not disrupt very sensitive negotiations like what we're seeing happen in this case. But, you know, President Biden, as you see on the screen, has a long history here as a senator himself, and he's been reluctant to see a White House engage. He was a vice president who tried to work with President Obama to get some of these actions through. And now there has to have been some coordination on the part of the president with some of these key lawmakers involved to make sure that the president would be moving the needle in the right direction tonight and not harming it. But this is one that the White House feels like is a speech he has to give.
Mike Memoli outside the White House. Mem, thank you very much. By the way, you can watch the president's speech. You can stream it right here, 7:30 Eastern on NBC News Now. You heard Mike talk about what Congress is doing. And on Capitol Hill, we've seen this discussion, this debate, at times emotional, at times intense, as members try to move forward in the House Judiciary Committee on a package of gun violence prevention bills. Listen to this.
We have a war on the children of America.
You are not going to bully your way into stripping Americans of fundamental rights.
I'm stunned by some of the words that we're hearing on the other side of the aisle. Where is their outrage over the slaughter of 19 fourth graders and their 2 teachers?
Over on the Senate side, talks are happening, bipartisan talks, with a source close to them, telling NBC News there's a, quote, framework for a bill on gun safety. They're talking about more money for mental health services, more school security, expanding background checks, and importantly, incentives for states to pass so-called red flag laws, which lets guns, firearms, be taken away from people who are deemed to be a threat to themselves or others. I want to bring in now Avenatti. Hallie, let me start on the House side of the Capitol today, because it was pretty contentious. Besides what we heard on both sides, we had one congressman doing a virtual show and tell, kind of, with guns and magazines. I think the meeting's still happening even tonight as we enter into the evening at this point. What is the expectation for what comes out of this?
Yeah, they're expecting a late night here. Technically, they can't go past midnight. Don't ask me why. These are some arcane House rules that govern some of these committee processes. But nevertheless, they do expect to finish in the late hours this evening. All of this was done with the goal of teeing up the House to come back in session next week, be able to put this package of bills through the Rules Committee on Tuesday, and then put it to the full House floor Wednesday or Thursday. That's what my sources are telling me to expect. Speaker Pelosi not being nearly so specific in her letter to colleagues that just came out a little while ago, but saying that we should expect to see a vote on the very things that you're seeing on your screen right now at some point next week when the House gets back. Of course, my sources have told me that they view this package of bills on guns as low-hanging fruit. That being said, it doesn't change how feasible, or rather not feasible, many of these things are when it crosses over to the Senate.
So talk to me then about what's happening on the other side of the Capitol, because the Senate is where I think a lot of the focus is, in part because the House can pass something, but it's not going to become law unless the Senate passes it as well. And that is where there is more of an uphill battle because of how closely divided that chamber is. You had today
exactly.
I was going to say, the interesting part today to me is what we heard from Mitch McConnell, who is the top Senate Republican, who again said, listen, he's asked this Republican senator from Texas, John Cornyn, to come up with something, what he says, consistent with the Second Amendment. Put this into plain English, right? Put McConnell speak into plain English. Where is the common ground, and what is the likelihood they'll find it with Democrats?
He has said this so many times, and I think you and I both are looking at Mitch McConnell because even though he's not in the negotiating room, he basically is, because he's the person that blessed John Cornyn being in the negotiating room. Cornyn, of course, very close to McConnell, a former deputy of his, still someone who has potential hopes of being in, if not Senate leadership again, then the top spot. So McConnell blessing Cornyn being as part of these negotiations is very important. The way that McConnell is talking about these Senate negotiations right now, though, is really important for us to understand where they're at, because he keeps saying that he wants to see things that solve the root of the problem, which is, in his words, mental health and school safety. That's not new to hear Republicans talking about that. But when you consider some of the things that are on the table for this bipartisan group of negotiators, it is important to note that those are two things that are on the table in addition to background checks and red flag laws. It's why there's some optimism that there could be something that comes from these negotiations, but it doesn't really matter what the House does because the Senate's really on their own timeline.
Avenatti, thank you very much for bringing us up to speed on the latest there. In other news now, the once media darling, now disgraced attorney Michael Avenatti is going to have to spend some more time behind bars. He was sentenced in a courtroom in Manhattan today to 4 years in prison for stealing from his former client, former porn star Stormy Daniels. The judge saying today that Avenatti's crime was committed out of desperation. Before he was sentenced, Avenatti himself got choked up delivering his own statement, saying he disappointed a lot of people. A lawyer for Daniels blasted Avenatti, saying he not only victimized her, but abandoned her. Remember, Avenatti was convicted of something else, wire fraud and identity theft back in February for keeping about $300,000 in advance that Daniels was paid for a book she wrote that included details about her alleged affair with former President Trump before he became president, something he denies. Avenatti's already in prison for his 2020 conviction for trying to extort Nike. I want to bring in Tom Winter now with more. Tom, bring us up to speed.
Right, Hallie. So of those 40 years, 2.5 are going to be served consecutively with that Nike scheme that he was convicted on. So what that actually means is that of the 4 years, 1.5 years he'll serve while he's serving his sentence for the other case. So this will just be tacked on. It puts him out of prison sometime in late 2025, perhaps 2026 is when he's expected to get out. Of course, he has a trial in California on completely unrelated fraud type charges that go back to the legal work he did out on the West Coast. That is scheduled for trial in July after the initial case went to mistrial. So Avenatti's legal headaches are not over in their entirety, though they are with respect to New York. These were the two cases brought by federal prosecutors in Manhattan, and essentially based on the testimony at trial and what the jury convicted him on is that he told the publisher for Daniels' book company that he was the one to receive the payments and said specifically, don't reach out to her, don't talk to her, and sent communications that indicated that. And so he was wired 2 payments, which totaled approximately $300,000 that you referenced there, Hallie, to go directly to him and not to communicate with Daniels herself. Now, the two of them did have a contract that said he might be entitled to a percentage of their book deal, but apparently they did not have that ironed out in writing. Avenatti not only was involved in his own defense, but actually cross-examined Stormy Daniels at trial. But eventually he was convicted of those charges. And so that's where we stand.
Tom Winter, thank you. Not too long ago, the White House said it expects COVID vaccination for kids under the age of 5. They're putting a date on it, gang, as early as June 21st. That's less than 3 weeks away. This is a big deal because, you know, these kids, the littlest ones in this country, 6 months to 5 years old, they're the only group left in the U.S. not yet eligible for these shots. Before this happens, right, before shots in arms, you've got the FDA that needs to review Pfizer and Moderna's trial data. Then they both have to give the green light on the vaccine. The thinking is that should happen right around June 15th. The White House says even though June 21st is the expectation for first shots in arms, it could take a matter of days to kind of ramp up the effort to make sure that you can get an appointment, et cetera. But obviously a lot of parents waiting to hear this news, waiting for this moment. Coming up here on the show, Amber Heard's attorney says she wants to appeal and that social media played a role in Johnny Depp's defamation trial verdict. We're going to get into what Heard's options are now. Plus, the Department of Education erasing billions of dollars of federal student loans for students who went to schools it says lied about future job prospects. Stay with us. Just one day after the verdict in the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp trial, Heard's attorney says she wants to appeal And she's talking now about all the social media posts she says certainly influenced the case and turned the courtroom into, in her words, a zoo. During the 6-week civil trial, posts on TikTok and Twitter went viral. You see them here, overwhelmingly appeared to favor Depp. Heard's attorneys think jurors couldn't escape the intense social media frenzy around this whole thing.
They went home every night. They have families. The families are on social media. We had a 10-day break in the middle because of the judicial conference. There's no way they couldn't have been influenced by it. And it was horrible.
We brought you the breaking news on that verdict 24 hours ago. Remember, Heard in court listening as the jury awarded Depp $15 million in damages. The judge reduced it to just over $10 million because of a state cap on damages, etc. Heard received $2 million. Depp was spotted after the verdict at a bar in the UK as the case came to a close Wednesday. He's been there overseas doing some performances. He said in a statement the jury has given him his life back. Let me bring in Steve Patterson, who's continuing to cover this one with us. So the latest on today of this whole thing, right? Verdict yesterday, big moment. Today now, Heard's attorney says they want to appeal. They say she has excellent grounds for it, in part because the jury was not sequestered with all this intense social media attention. When you talk to legal experts, Steve, do you think she does have grounds for an appeal?
So the short answer is yes, she has a shot. The long answer is, of course, a little more complicated. I mean, you could look at this case, and when you're talking about an appeal, it's never usually supposed to be a referendum on the jury or the jury's decision. So an appellate court would have to find some fault with a decision that the judge made. And you could point to several things and say, OK, that's grounds for an appeal. For instance, cameras allowed in court. Right. You could argue that those cameras allowed for this media circus to blow up and in some way, in some form, influence the jury. You could look at the sequestering of the jury or the lack thereof, you know, the 10-day conference in between, the long holiday weekend. Inevitably, those jurors are going home to their friends and family. And you have to say, as a human being, it would be impossible for you to be completely immune from the coverage that's going on, from the circus that's online. And then Heard's team alleges that there is some evidence that wasn't allowed to be admitted, medical records, damaging text messages that were sent out in some form. Even the decision of the UK court, which was in favor, not in favor of Johnny Depp, that wasn't allowed to be discussed in court as well. So you could point to those several key incidents, several things, and say that, yes, she probably likely has a shot. But again, with everything in this trial, it's complicated.
Complicated for sure, including some of the reaction on social media during and after the trial, right? People, including celebrities, seem to be picking sides. You had singer Jordan Pruitt, who simply hashtag truth wins. Amy Schumer shared a Gloria Steinem quote, on the other hand, that said, in part, she will need her sisterhood, seen as an allusion to Amber Heard. A lot came up during this trial. This verdict was a big deal to a lot of people, not just for what it says on its face, but for, I think, people who are looking at this in the broader context of domestic abuse. What does this mean for Depp and Heard moving forward, Steve?
So as far as their maybe entertainment prospects, their ability to work, you know, again, it's complicated. I'm not an entertainment expert, but I know a guy who is. There's a guy named Matt Bellany. He's a former reporter for THR. I'm sure you know him, Hallie, working here. Former entertainment attorney. I spoke to him. I asked him, what are their job prospects? He says as far as a major studio touching either one of these two anytime soon, it's not likely at all. Look for them maybe in more independent work. Johnny Depp could pop up in something that's a little bit smaller. Amber Heard already has an independent project that you will see her in, and she's still going to be in Aquaman 2. Her role has not been cut out of that movie whatsoever. But then I asked him, okay, Johnny Depp won the court of public opinion. He won this trial. Why not any chance of him popping up in a major studio? He said he engaged in 6 months of mudslinging. No studio is going to take a chance on him after that. There may be a cooling off period where we reassess Johnny Depp or even reassess Amber Heard. All it takes is another Me Too movement to pop up. There's already comparisons to sort of a Monica Lewinsky situation, of course, during the Clinton administration, and then 10 years after, we see her in a completely different light. All of this, of course, is possible, but again, it's the theme. All of this is complicated. It may take some time before we know.
Steve Patterson, thank you for breaking down the complicated. Appreciate it. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, the Education Department is going to forgive all the remaining federal student debt for people who went to schools affiliated with the Corinthian Colleges chain, a for-profit chain. The DOE is going to erase debt for more than 500,000 borrowers to the tune of like almost $6 billion. This is a lot of money. If you are a former student, if you do have debt, you don't actually have to do anything to get those loans forgiven. They just will be. Number two, the White House says it's relaunching its internship program and for the first time ever, paying those interns. Doesn't that sound nice? They're going to get $750 a week. The administration says it hopes this will help make the program more accessible to lower income students. Number three, a toddler has been reunited with his parents in this country after being left in Afghanistan last August. Look at this little 2-year-old left behind in the chaos at Kabul airport. He didn't have an Afghan passport. In January, the Taliban halted flights for Afghan refugees bound for America. They only restarted about a month ago. Number four, Turkey, the country, is getting a new name, at least at the United Nations. The UN agreed to recognize it as Türkiye following a request from the country's foreign minister. That's how it's pronounced in Turkish. The move is seen as a push by the country to rebrand and to disassociate from turkey the bird, like the Thanksgiving dish. Number five, American tennis star Coco Gauff won her semifinal at the French Open today, meaning she, for the first time, is going to end up in a Grand Slam final. She is 18 years old. And she's also using her voice. You see, she just wrote on the camera there. She wrote, "Peace, end gun violence. Love, Coco." That's what she stopped to do after her win. Coming up, an NBC News investigation. A company making weapons for Russia that used to be a client of a powerful American consulting firm. That's our original tonight. Plus, President Biden promised to treat Saudi Arabia as a pariah state during the 2020 campaign. Now, we're just learning he's planning to go there soon like this month. We're going to have the latest on this developing news just into us when we come back. Breaking news coming into us not too long ago. Sources with knowledge of the president's travel plans tell NBC he's expected to visit Saudi Arabia this month and probably will meet with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He's also going to visit Israel on the same trip. This is really interesting. It comes as the Biden administration this week made it a point to praise the Saudis for their role in getting an extension to a truce in Yemen and then in today's OPEC agreement to boost oil production. Joining me now is Josh Letterman, who is, I think, in Rehoboth Beach, where the president will head after the speech tonight. This is interesting, Josh, because this is a reversal, this meeting with the Saudis on the part of the president. He called them a pariah state when he was running in 2020. MBS is considered to be, complicit, essentially, in the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Why now? Why are they doing this now?
Well, this has been percolating for quite a while, and a lot of speculation, Hallie, about whether Biden would add these stops to his trip to Europe for some summits that's coming up. I think you set it up perfectly. I mean, the Biden administration, President Biden himself, have been very critical in the past of Saudi Arabia, but they have come to appreciate the fact that there's no going around Saudi Arabia when it comes to our issues in the Middle East, and frankly, now with the economy and oil prices globally. And so they have been forced to find ways to try to improve this relationship, work with the Saudis, particularly on issues like oil prices. And the Biden administration had praised as recently as today the Saudis for leading OPEC to agree to increase oil production this summer. They need them when it comes to Iran. They need them when it comes to stability in the Middle East, as well as other, major multinational issues. And so President Biden is expected to make this stop both in Israel and Saudi. And that's really important because we've seen this rapprochement in the last several years, frankly, due to the Trump administration's work with the Abraham Accords to bring Israel closer to countries like the United Arab Emirates that did not recognize Israel in the past. The next domino to fall in that long-term shift would be Saudi Arabia. The Biden administration very eager to see if they can help bridge that gap between Saudi Arabia and Israel.
Some geopolitical dynamics happening here. Josh Letterman, thank you. Great scoop, by the way, with your colleagues, I know, on our team to bring that to us. Appreciate it. Today, the U.S. is announcing a whole new round of sanctions on Russia as we stick with international news. Kind of a team effort involving the Treasury, State, and Commerce departments to target Russian elites, basically, these people close to Vladimir Putin. It even includes a prominent Russian cellist who also happens to be the godfather of one of Putin's daughters, and yachts linked to President Putin himself. It comes as in the eastern part of the country. One official says Russia now controls most of the key cities there, one key city in particular. But over in the south, Ukrainian forces say they're also taking back some ground outside Kherson. Earlier today, Russia had a warning for the West that giving Ukraine more weapons is only going to bring more suffering. But that is not stopping Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky from asking for more. especially because, according to him, Russia now controls 20% of Ukraine. That's a lot, 20%. And that brings us to tonight's original in-depth reporting on a topic we've been keeping an eye on. We just talked about this new round of sanctions on Russian elites. And one oligarch who was sanctioned early on in this invasion was Sergei Shemazov, the CEO of this huge defense company called Rostec. Now, a new NBC News investigation is finding this company that makes missiles, attack helicopters, electronic warfare systems in Russia, used to be a client of the famous American consulting firm McKinsey. One expert says that's a problem, given the fact that McKinsey also does hundreds of millions of dollars worth of work for the U.S. government. Dan DeLuce has the story.
Behind President Vladimir Putin's war machine against Ukraine sits Rostec, a massive weapons maker. It's controlled by the Kremlin and until recently a client of a leading American consulting firm, McKinsey & Company. McKinsey also advises the U.S. government, including hundreds of millions of dollars worth of work for the Pentagon, according to an NBC News investigation. Marianne Jennings, a business ethics professor at Arizona State, says the firm's work raises alarming conflict of interest concerns.
I find it scary, but this is really serious national security stuff. I find it serious for that reason. At some point, it has to bother you that you are helping the enemy.
McKinsey, along with hundreds of other businesses, withdrew from Russia shortly after Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, recently selling their Russian operations to top managers in the country. While a company spokesperson acknowledged in a statement to NBC News that it has worked with Rostec in the past, they say their work did not concern weapons systems. But Scott Blackland, the former head of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Russia, says working with Rostec is worrying.
This is a concern that any organization that is working with the American defense establishment is also working with the Russian defense establishment.
And it's not just in Russia. The firm is also under fire from Congress for its role in the deadly opioid epidemic.
McKinsey was advising both the Fox and the Hen House and getting paid by both.
McKinsey admitting to lawmakers it advised both opioid makers and the federal officials that regulate them.
Clearly, McKinsey should not be setting strategy for both drug companies and the FDA.
Though McKinsey denied any wrongdoing to Congress, the company agreed to pay out nearly $600 million to 49 states as part of a recent settlement over its role in the opioid crisis. With offices across the globe, McKinsey has also been in hot water from Senator Marco Rubio over its booming business in China, where it advises companies tied to the Chinese military. In 4 contracts obtained by NBC News that McKinsey had with the U.S. government, the company did not mention any potential conflict over its work in Russia or China.
But when they're contracting with the government, where there are regulations, they do have to disclose. Whether they have a conflict, they don't disclose it.
McKinsey says its work with Russian and Chinese defense players is separate, telling NBC in a statement that the company complies with all applicable U.S. contracting laws, including those regarding conflicts of interest.
Either way, no matter which way you turn, there are serious ethical issues with that. And you can't paint over it with, well, our contract with them was very limited. Well, that's not how consulting works.
The firm's work for both the U.S. and its adversaries has lawmakers and experts questioning if McKinsey should handle sensitive government contracts.
Dan DeLuce is joining us now behind that investigative piece. So, Dan, talk about, you mentioned right at the end of the piece there, what the ripple effects, what the domino effects are, could be more recently now as it relates to McKinsey's business dealings.
That's right. The FDA now is saying that it will stop hiring McKinsey for consulting contracts pending the outcome of investigations into the role they played in the opioid epidemic. That comes after a flurry of criticism from Congress. And there are also questions over McKinsey's work to the point where a bipartisan group of senators are proposing legislation aimed at preventing conflicts of interest for companies like McKinsey. And then in Paris, French police have raided McKinsey's offices in part of an investigation for possible tax fraud. Hallie?
Dan DeLuce live for us on that. Dan, thank you. NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day. And because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our Midwest Bureau, 3 people were hospitalized after a hot air balloon hit a train in Burlington, Wisconsin. Witnesses say the balloon, something happened. They don't know. They say it was in some sort of distress. It bounced off a building and then hit a freight train. Federal investigators are now trying to figure out how in the world this happened. From our Northeast Bureau, check this out. Manhole explosions in the financial district of Boston this morning. Scary stuff. One woman was hospitalized after she got burned, maybe by steam. Fire officials evacuated 2 buildings. They think it happened because of some sort of overpressurization underground. Yikes. From our West Coast Bureau, in Southern California, they are restricting water with the state's droughts getting worse and worse. These new rules are in place that limit outdoor watering to only once a week for more than 6 million people. The goal is to try to slash water use by 35%. Time now to get the backstory. Our behind-the-scenes look at how a story comes together and how it fits into our bigger picture. And for tonight, we're taking it to Mississippi, where a school board there has put its first black superintendent on leave less than a year after she was hired. Our Antonia Hilton wanted to know why. And Dr. Kenitra Easy told her she thinks it was about race. The superintendent says she tried to bring a predominantly black school's facilities and programming up to the standards of the district's predominantly white school. For example, the district's Gifted and Talented program is at the predominantly white K-12 campus. The remedial program is at the predominantly black school. Theater, she says, as an example, was taught in the white school. Drug education in the school that was more predominantly black. Dr. Easy was concerned about the condition of the black school's facilities. There wasn't any air conditioning in the school's gym for 7 years almost. She also proposed putting a new district-wide pre-K program at the predominantly black school. Then one parent sent Dr. Easy an anonymous letter. Listen to what happened after that.
The parent told me that I was being watched very, very closely, that I had no right to try to make changes.
When you look back at that letter now, was it prophetic?
It was absolutely. When I was hired, I was told, don't poke the bear. And Stringer, leave Stringer alone.
Stringer is the predominantly white school we talked about. Now, on March 3rd, the school board called a special meeting and voted to put Dr. Easy on paid leave pending termination. We should note NBC News placed numerous calls, wrote numerous emails to district and state officials. None of them provided any comment for this story. Let me bring in Antonia Hilton, who is joining us now. And Antonia, you know this segment, really a look behind the scenes at what it was like to put this reporting together, right? How did you find out about this school? What drew, or this district, I should say, and what drew you to tell that story?
Well, Hallie, frankly, we saw a local news article, and it mentioned that the first black superintendent of this rural district was being placed on leave mere months into the job, and it was after she had tried to institute some new programs like the pre-K that you just mentioned. And the article at first didn't have a lot of details about the racial relations in this town, but just the mention that she was the first black superintendent there, that she had tried these different initiatives. We thought something must be up here. Let's give a call to people in town and let's give her a call. So I called a bunch of people up, and the story really unfolded from there. And what we found was a community that for years has been racially segregated. Black community members saying that their school has been treated like it's second best, that they have been asking for resources, updates to classrooms. There's mold in many parts of the school. The gym, as you mentioned, didn't have AC in the Mississippi heat for 7 years, and they felt like their white counterparts had much better resources. And so we really wanted to dig into this, because in this moment where race and education is really at the front of so many stories, we wanted to understand really, how is there this headline that maybe people would think would have been something from a couple decades ago, right now in 2022, with this first black superintendent trying to bring the white half and the black half of a district together, and now finding that her job is on the line.
I know she's still waiting for a hearing. And Antonia, one of the things that struck me as I was watching your piece, and as I understand about your reporting about this, you talked with, you're out there in rural Mississippi. I think you talked with, was he a Stringer parent? The guy, you talked with one guy who basically said to you, something along the lines, and I'm paraphrasing, like, I think we should be focusing less on race. Like, we shouldn't be talking about race so much. This isn't about race. I wonder what your experience was like, sort of being there, trying to talk to people like that parent, who I think was a parent of somebody at Stringer, right, at the predominantly white school?
That's right. And that line is something we heard all the time as we were trying to talk to particularly white families, that, they'd acknowledge that, maybe it didn't look great that their first black superintendent was on their way out the door, but that ultimately it's not really about race. She just should have done her job better. But it was really hard to get anyone to answer, what did she do wrong? And in fact, the school still hasn't provided her with a letter or an email or any kind of documentation that lists why they are moving to terminate her. Specific, data points or just qualitative descriptions of what she did wrong. She's still waiting for all of that. And we would call, and sometimes people would hang up on us at the school district offices. So we got a sense of some of the hostility there. In fact, some people in town wrote emails to our cameraman, who's an immigrant to the United States, telling him that instead of filming the schools, he should learn how to speak English, Hallie. So I think that gives you a sense of the tension there and how that tension actually ended up turning back on our own team.
That is disturbing to hear, Antonia. I also thought, was struck by the fact, listen, I've reported stories where you sort of ask for comment. Maybe they ultimately don't give you an on-camera comment, but you get some sort of pro forma statement, right? I mean, you got nothing from the local, the district, the state. Did they say anything at all, or was it just because, listen, we're a national news organization, right? Oftentimes there are people, and I've used this line a lot in my own reporting of like, hey, we would love to make sure we get your perspective on. We would love to make sure that we share sort of your side of the story here. Nothing from them, huh?
Absolutely nothing. Sometimes we would call the office and an assistant would just hang up. We sent dozens and dozens of emails, tons of voicemails, text messages, and couldn't get responses. The only people who did respond were some state officials who would say we can't comment on local personnel matters. And we would always get directed back to the school district.
Got it.
And they consistently refused to talk to us, Hallie.
Antonia Helton, it's important reporting, and I appreciate you, as I know you will, stand on top of it with what happens with the superintendent down the road. Appreciate it. Tomorrow, Disney Plus will drop a new episode of its hit Star Wars series, Obi-Wan Kenobi. But instead of fans just talking about that today, some of the spotlight is on racist and hateful messages that one of its actors, Moses Ingram, is getting online just because she's black. Ingram stars as Reva on the show. And this week, she posted some examples of the just gross comments, racist messages she's getting on Instagram, some of which included the N-word. Her co-star and executive producer of the show, Ewan McGregor, posted a video about this.
We stand with Moses. We love Moses. And if you're sending her bullying messages, you're no Star Wars fan in my mind. There's no place for racism in this world.
The Star Wars official Twitter account tweeting about it, saying, if anybody intends to make her feel in any way unwelcome, we have only one thing to say. We resist. Maggie Vespa is in L.A. following the story for us. And Maggie, prior to Obi-Wan Kenobi debuting on Disney Plus, Ingram says some of the executives warned her that she might face harassment, but those conversations were all behind the scenes, right?
Exactly. Behind the scenes, none of this really went public until Ingram posted screenshots of the messages she was getting, along with a video condemning those messages. And then it was kind of this watershed moment that we're seeing. McGregor, who plays Obi-Wan Kenobi, putting out his message that you just showed part of, the Star Wars account putting out their statement. But it was definitely Ingram who got the ball rolling in this case, and Hallie just refused to stay silent about what she was seeing.
John Boyega, who's an actor, Kelly Marie Tran, they've also talked about some of the racist hate they got after appearing in some of the Star Wars movies. Disney handled those experiences in a specific way, right?
Exactly. So Boyega, just the backstory here, is black. Tran is Vietnamese American, and both endured similar racist vitriol, basically, with some on social media even calling for boycotts on the entire Star Wars franchise just because they were cast. And Tran, in 2018, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times titled, "I won't be marginalized by online harassment." Disney Plus isn't commenting on those past examples and, frankly, didn't say much at the time. And some people are pointing that out now. In contrast to what's happening tonight, they're coming out in strong defense of Ingram and these latest racist attacks.
Maggie Vespa, thank you very much. Appreciate you bringing that to us. When we come back, things getting lit in London and across the UK tonight. Just the start of a long weekend celebrating the Queen and her 70-year reign. But it's coming with some questions about the future of the monarchy and the roles of the royals. We're getting into all of that, plus some developing news from the Queen today with Keir Simmons next. A little bit of breaking news just into us. We have now learned that next Thursday, June 9th, so a week from today, the January 6th House Select Committee investigating what happened in the days before and leading up to the insurrection will hold its first public hearing in prime time, 8 p.m. And the committee says it will present previously unseen material documenting the day of the Capitol riot. We will have special coverage right here on NBC News Now. I'll be hosting along with my colleague Tom Yamas. We'll see you for that then. To news now from overseas. On the lighter side, the first day of celebration for Queen Elizabeth, 70 years on the throne, just about wrapping up over in the UK. And while she was a big part of a bunch of events today, she's going to miss a kind of a big one tomorrow. In this new statement, Buckingham Palace says she is not going to be at the St. Paul's Cathedral service, saying she greatly enjoyed today's parade and fly past or fly by, but she did experience some discomfort. That's what they said, some discomfort. You're looking at the last event of the day, the beacon lighting at Windsor Castle, which capped off, boy, a whirlwind of stuff. First, the Trooping the Color parade, where Prince Charles took the royal suit on behalf of the Queen. Then this balcony appearance we just showed you with other royals. You know who we didn't see was Prince Harry and Meghan, no longer doing public duties, no longer working members of the royal family, but you did spot them through a window in Buckingham Palace. They were watching the parade from inside. Some eagle-eyed photojournalists got that shot. Keir Simmons has been covering all this. I don't think he slept in 42 hours. He's joining us now. Busy day, Keir, today, busy day tomorrow. And now this idea of the Queen having some discomfort, Buckingham Palace says. What does that mean? Do we know anything else? How big of a deal is this that they're announcing that and that she's not going to participate in this event tomorrow?
Well, you know, Hallie, I have to say that the event tomorrow, the service at St Paul's Cathedral, would be probably the event the Queen would really want to attend. We know how important her faith is to her. So for her not to be able to be there, I think that tells you a lot about how she was feeling today. She came out onto the balcony. She smiled. She clearly smiled at seeing just the huge numbers of people. Where I'm standing right now was just absolutely thronging with people here on the world-famous Mall running down to Buckingham Palace there behind me. She clearly really enjoyed those moments, but we now are getting this picture that it wasn't easy for her, honestly, and she wasn't able to go to the parade ground at the other end of the Mall here to see the Trooping the Colour. So for her to make it right across London to St Paul's Cathedral, she's now at Windsor Castle, actually, which she considers more of a home in this part of the world. For her to make it right the way to St Paul's Cathedral, it just clearly, and then for a full church service, I think just clearly was too much for her. By the way, Hallie, the lovely illuminations of Buckingham Palace behind me there, they switched those off this evening, then just suddenly switched them on in the past few minutes. So they must have known it was time for Hallie Jackson now.
You're good luck, Keir Simmons. That's exactly what it is. The throngs of people are still there. We see some spectators waving behind your shoulder. Listen, tons of people cheering, tons of people celebrating today. But Keir, there were also some protests, right? And you saw, I think it was the hashtag abolish the monarchy hashtag that was trending online for a little bit at some point. You're on the ground there. Can you give us more of a sense of what it's like? Like, on the one hand, people who love to see this pomp and circumstance. On the other, people who feel like the sort of royals they're past their time, if you will.
Yeah, you know, we didn't see that here today, I have to say. But what we did see, and I thought it was fascinating, was the royal family, and particularly I think the Queen, choreograph a shift, a changing era, honestly. You saw the Queen on 3 occasions. You saw a lot more, for example, of Prince Charles, of William. And I think the message was, we're kind of changing the shop window, if you like. And we want to get people used to the idea that slowly, over time, there's going to be a change in the monarchy here in the UK, and you know, that's going to be very difficult for people to come to terms with. The Queen, after all, has been Queen, as we have said on a number of occasions this week, Hallie, for most people, for as long as they can remember.
Right.
I think they really did it masterfully today, though. At that moment with Prince Louis on the balcony back there, which just made everybody laugh, where he was playing around. And at the same time clearly didn't particularly enjoy the flyover. Notice how Kate and even his great-grandmother, the Queen, didn't intervene, didn't interrupt him. They understand that those hijinks, if you like, they are often a feature of the younger children on that balcony, that people enjoy it, and that it's another part of royal history. So this is a family that understand how to gently shift the messaging, and I think you saw some of that today.
We're watching that now, that adorable moment there. And, you know, I think about thinking back to when William, listen, right. I'm 38, right? But I remember when William and Harry were younger. Is that applause for your live shot here?
There's still a crowd here, you know, so as soon as they think I'm finished, well, we get a little cheer, which is frankly about the best live shot I've ever done in my life, to be honest.
My God.
I need these guys to be coming with me everywhere I go.
I hope they buy you a pint, because I think your shift is done.
You can send someone to the studio.
I love it. Keir Simmons, you're the best.
I think a few of them have been for pints already.
Okay, very good. Keir, have fun. Go sign some autographs. Appreciate it. Appreciate you. And by the way, Keir has this new podcast out, Born to Rule. Listen to it anywhere you get your podcast. It answers some of the big questions about Prince Charles, the man who will one day become king. That's it for this hour. I hope you get some pints, too, if that's your thing. We're going to have more for you here tomorrow, same time, same place. Coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.